The experience of ages has shown that a man who works on the land is purer, nobler, higher, and more moral. Agriculture should be at the basis of everything. So wrote the great Russian author Nikolai Gogol, and he was right. In Russia, and subsequently the Soviet Union, agriculture really was at the heart of it all. Industrialization was vital, especially into the 20th century and the Cold War, but fundamentally, food security was the crux of the Soviet Union. The cycles of famine, whether naturally occurring or man-made, had plagued Tsars and Soviets alike. I'm your host David, and this week we are going to look at one of the first post-Stalin attempts to bring food security and even surplus to Soviet tables, a program that helped establish the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev. The Virgin Lands campaign also led to his eventual downfall. This is the Cold War. Shout out to World of Warships for kindly sponsoring this video. This free-to-play PC game has the best naval combat in the industry, action-filled sea battles decided by your talent, strategies, and tactics. The game features more than 400 fully customizable historical warships that you can control in beautiful maps with stunning graphics, and changing weather affecting the course of battle. More than 44 million players already battle in World of Warships using speedy maneuverable destroyers, battleships with the thickest armor and mightiest guns, universal cruisers, which are both useful in attack and defense, and the aircraft carrier, masters of reconnaissance and devastating airstrikes. As you can see, everyone will find something that will suit their style of play, so what are you waiting for? Use our link and the code BOOM to get a huge starter pack, 200 doubloons, 2 ships, the St. Louis and the premium ship Emden, 20 of the Restless Fire camouflage, 2.5 million credits, and 7 days of the premium account. The triumph of communism over fascism in the Great Patriotic War brought hope that more attention would be directed towards food security and less towards industry, but this wasn't the case. Stalin continued to place all emphasis on industrial output, preparing for the inevitable war with the decadent and imperialist West. As a result, food shortages, including famine, persisted and even affected the center of it all, Moscow, where food scarcity was a regular occurrence. And then Stalin died. And along with the death of the Vozhd came an increased sense of freedom, even among party leaders, who now felt more confident in voicing not only concerns over the general food situation, but even making suggestions on how to make changes for the better. As we already talked about in our episode on the death of Stalin, a bit of a leadership race broke out in the weeks, months, and years after the mustache died. One of the early candidates was, of course, Georgy Malenkov, who very early on began advocating for agricultural reform, or at least the government policies surrounding agricultural reform. He introduced practices like the government purchasing agricultural products at higher prices, a reduction in taxes, the forgiveness of debts, and encouraged the use of individual peasant plots, all in the hopes of encouraging and fostering greater motivation by agricultural workers to produce more. Khrushchev, not wanting to lag behind Malenkov, did not waste much time in making his stance known, and at a plenum in September of 1953, Nikita openly criticized the agricultural situation in the Soviet Union. He followed this up in January of 1954 with a letter to the Presidium of the Central Committee, where he pointed out that the Soviet Union had collected more grain in 1940 than it had in 1953. Malenkov responded by suggesting the introduction of more intensive farming methods on land that was already in use. Khrushchev, on the other hand, proposed a rather drastic increase in the land cultivated by expanding agriculture by an astonishing 13 million hectares, which had never been used for agricultural purposes before, the so-called Virgin Lands. Much of the proposed land was in Kazakhstan, but local leadership had some concerns. Not only were they doubtful of the overall productivity capable of the proposed lands, but they also had concerns over the influx of ethnic Russians into Kazakhstan that was sure to accompany the campaign. Khrushchev, not accepting the dissent from the leadership in the republics, or even more local apparatuses, took the decision to change the Kazakhstan party leadership, promoting a new group who would be more loyal to him. Included in these promotions was a new second secretary of the Kazakhstan Republic Communist Party, one Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. You may have heard of him. In March of 1954, the decision was made. The Central Committee of the Communist Party decreed that the amount of agricultural land sown would be increased by 33 million acres in the 1954-55 harvest year. This was expected to result in an increase of 18 to 20 million metric tons of harvested grain. The virgin lands selected for cultivation included areas of Kazakhstan, Siberia, the Urals, as well as lands along the Volga River and into the North Caucasus. The land itself was composed of chernozem and chestnut soils, the fertile and rich black soil characteristic of the Russian steppe. So, some of you may be wondering, if the soil was so suitable, why hadn't it been cultivated up until that point? And it really is a key question, the answers to which would haunt the Virgin Lands campaign throughout its duration. 2 words sum up the answer: climate and infrastructure. The regions chosen, despite the good soil, had been left uncultivated because they were well known for long dry spells and for heavy frosts. Both of these things are devastating for sustained agriculture, so the lands were largely undeveloped. This in turn meant a lack of infrastructure. This doesn't just mean that transport networks weren't in place, but basic things like a lack of adequate housing, or any kind of housing depending on the region. In addition, the Soviet Union simply didn't have enough farming equipment to be able to take on such a dramatic increase in cultivated land, especially with such a short relative lead time. And even if all of these issues could be overcome and massive increases in agricultural output realized, the new areas lacked storage facilities to store the harvests after they were collected. And finally, as if this wasn't enough to give pause to implementing the campaign, there was a human resources issue. And I don't mean Debbie, the human resources manager, coming around to my desk yet again to tell me that I didn't put a cover sheet on my TPS report. No, by human resources issue, we mean simply that there was a general shortage of trained professionals like agricultural experts, soil scientists, and even tractor drivers. But despite all of this, Nikita, renowned for his stubbornness, had made up his mind and proceeded to launch the campaign despite the warning signs. He believed that the increased harvests that would come from the newly cultivated lands would be enough to negate the potential negatives. So, in the spring of 1954, the Virgin Lands campaign was kicked off. 20,000 tractors were moved into the new areas that were to be cultivated. By 1955, that number had increased by 10 times. In the Soviet press, the campaign was portrayed as a project requiring the mobilization of the Soviet people, akin to a call-up in a time of war. Hundreds of thousands of Komsomol activists, agricultural experts, and people in search of a better life volunteered to relocate to the Virgin Lands. And some, it should be noted, were voluntold to relocate to the Virgin Lands. Army conscripts were used as a labor force, as well as to help speed the campaign. By August of 1954, 33.5 million acres of new land had been plowed, and hopes were running high. And those hopes came to fruition with an exceptional harvest. Overall yields in 1954 were 65% higher than previous years. So all's well that ends well, right? Well, actually, no. It only took until the next year's harvest for issues to manifest themselves. 1955 saw a drought in Kazakhstan and some of the neighboring regions, resulting in a 35% drop in crop yields, even with the additional land under cultivation. However, a bountiful harvest from the more established agricultural regions of the Soviet Union was able to compensate for the drop in yields. 1956, however, really set the bar for the Virgin Lands campaign. It was by far the most productive and successful year of the program, resulting in the largest harvest in the history of the Soviet Union to that point. Overall grain output across the Soviet Union was 50% higher than in the pre-campaign years. Of course, based on these results, the campaign was extended for a few more years. 1957 saw another poor harvest, but 1958 and 1959 were both considered good years, providing further life to the program. But, and here's the but you all knew was coming, successive harvests in the early 1960s were poor and ultimately contributed to the end of the Virgin Lands campaign. Now, before we get into the results and effects of the Virgin Lands campaign, I want to talk about one of the most high-profile topics within the campaign itself. I'm talking about corn. Nikita Khrushchev was, I don't know if obsessed with corn is the right word, but certainly focused on it. He was very much impressed with the American corn industry, which had been promoted strongly by American farmers like Roswell Garst, and Nikita strongly advocated for the expansion of Soviet corn production to be used as a solution for livestock feed. A corn research institute was established in Ukraine, and land dedicated to growing corn in the Soviet Union was expanded from 4.3 million hectares in 1954 to 18 million hectares in 1955. Like so much of the Virgin Lands campaign, the program saw early successes, but when Khrushchev insisted on expanding corn production into land that was less well suited for corn, problems began to occur. A portion of the land used for this expansion had been used for other crops, so when corn harvests failed, it was not just the corn that wasn't available, but also the crop that would have been grown there originally that was then unavailable. For example, in 1962, corn was being cultivated on 37 million hectares of land, but the productivity was quite low. By some estimates, 20% of the cultivated land produced no harvest whatsoever, but also produced no hay, which would have been grown in much of that land in the past. Khrushchev and his love affair with corn has been turned into a bit of a joke in recent years, but it did have real-world consequences. And one last thing about this, don't settle in life. Make sure that you find someone who looks at you the way that Nikita looks at corn. Okay, so now we should look at the impacts of the Virgin Lands campaign itself, because it did have some quite profound effects. Politically, it weakened Khrushchev. His profile and image, already hurting from his supposed weakness in the face of the Americans during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikita was forced to acknowledge that despite some successes, he had been unable to resolve the Soviet issue over food security. October of 1964 saw his removal from office on charges of voluntarism, or too often making independent decisions to proceed with his own plans and ignoring the opinions of other party leaders. Let's not forget that at this point, the Soviet Union was no longer the autocratic nation it was under Stalin, controlled by one man, but rather an autocratic nation ruled by consensus of the small group of men who led the party. Khrushchev stepped beyond those boundaries too many times, including prominently with the Virgin Lands campaign, and ultimately paid the price. Of course, in one of those ironic twists of history, a man that Khrushchev had nominated to help lead the damp squib of a campaign was the man who orchestrated his ouster and took over the USSR's top spot, the aforementioned Leonid Brezhnev. Of course, the campaign did more than just cause political change. There were social consequences as well. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens moved to these newly developed lands in order to contribute to the campaign. The propaganda campaign we mentioned briefly a few minutes earlier encouraged young people to move to the Virgin Lands and to help in the great endeavor. Of course, many of these people lacked proper housing, and living conditions and life in the new regions was difficult. Many of the people who moved were not used to the climate. Imagine growing up near the shores of the Black Sea with its temperate climate, to then finding yourself trying to grow crops on the steppes of Central Asia. For the native people who already lived in the regions, they were often forced to abandon their traditional labor and lifestyle in order to engage in the new cultivation project. And of course, the impact on demographics was profound. In republics like Kazakhstan, the large influx of ethnic Russians began to decrease the relative dominance of the Kazakhs in favor of the Russians, something that would go on to have a major impact in the republic in the late days of the Soviet Union, and especially after the collapse of the USSR. And we can't talk about the Virgin Lands campaign without talking about the environmental impact that occurred from the program. Land erosion, increased soil acidity, deflation, all of these were unintentional byproducts of the campaign. It might seem obvious to us that the sudden mass cultivation of new land would have an impact on the environment, and it may have been realized then also, but if it was simply ignored by the leadership. Of course, it is important to acknowledge that environmental concerns were not at the forefront of people's minds in the 1950s, and the absolute priority at the time was resolving the food issue. So these are all the upfront and obvious consequences of the Virgin Lands campaign. But there were some further consequences that took a bit longer to really manifest themselves. One was the impact on overall agricultural infrastructure across the Soviet Union. So the 1958 kolkhoz reform enabled collective farms to easily purchase farm machinery, including tractors. Many of these tractors that were then bought were used in the Virgin Lands campaign. But, and there's always a but, these newly cultivated lands with their shiny new tractors lacked the infrastructure to perform standard maintenance and repairs. Because the amount of new tractors and equipment that was directed to the Virgin Lands, the inability to perform repairs actually led to a decline in the number of agricultural vehicles in use in the Soviet Union between 1958 and 1961. That was the first time in 30 years that had happened. So, what is the legacy of the Virgin Lands campaign? Well, clearly it wasn't the unmitigated disaster of the Great Leap Forward that was happening in China at the same time. But it can't really be called a success either. Its stated goal, to resolve the food shortages in the Soviet Union, was simply not met. But it didn't fail either. In reality, a small increase in food supply was gained. As scholar Vadim Roginsky put, the problem was not solved, but there was some increase in the food ration of a Soviet citizen. Both success and failure was observed throughout the campaign itself, but both were impacted negatively by a lack of infrastructure as well as of human beings to carry out the work. In addition, such an ambitious plan was made by means of a political decision without the backing of any scientific consultation or even common sense, almost destined the Virgin Lands campaign to miss its goals from the beginning. It also allowed for the somewhat reformist-minded Khrushchev to be pushed to the side and replaced by a far more hardline leader, one who would ensure that any notion of domestic freedoms in the Soviet Union would have to wait over 20 more years before seeing the light of day. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode, but to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have clear-cut the area around the bell button, planting corn around it even if the land around it is clearly unsuitable. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. And don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it gets heated.